So thank you for coming, really appreciate it. My name is Ugo Border. I'm the president of the American Cetacean Society as well as the local chapter here. We're really happy to have you here, and I think your talk here today is very timely, of course. So for those who do not know Lynne, Lynne has been with the Protected Marine Resources Division at NOAA here in Seattle for 16 years, implementing Marine Mammal Protection Act, the MMPA, the Endangered Species Act. Since 2003, she has worked at the endangered listing of the southern resident killer whales, designated critical habitat, developed and finalized a recovery plan, and has implemented actions to conserve and recover whales, including vessel regulations put in place in 2011. In addition to her work on killer whales, Lynne supported the aspects of marine mammal programs such as the helping coordinate the stranding network. Lynne has also worked on the ESA listing of the rockfish, and coordinates with the Puget Sound salmon recovery efforts. Lynne's background is in marine mammal research, including field work in Southern California and Shark Bay in Western Australia, studying local social behavior in mothers and infants and genetic relationships of local dolphins. Those are the Tursiops and Duncus, and that one at the Indo-Pacific bottlenose. Putting underwater cameras on marine animals to learn about their lives. That was actually she was part of the Criticam team, or worked with the Criticam team with National Geographic, very exciting. And then, of course, first in the Office of Protected Resources in Silver Spring in Maryland. I remember that, yes. And then on the West Coast here, Lynne has been a BS in Bachelor of Science in Biology at Georgetown University and a Master of Science in Animal Behavior from San Diego State University. So Lynne, going to talk about these updates on the southern residents killer whales recovery, new initiatives and opportunities for public engagement. So Lynne, take it away. And if I need to turn the light off, maybe
So how many of you have seen me give a talk on killer whales before? All right, so I know this is an educated audience. Tonight I'm hoping to give you some new information, some of the latest stuff that's been happening, but just in case, just as a little bit of background, I'm going to talk about the southern resident killer whale distinct population segment that was listed as endangered back in 2005. And you probably all know the major threats identified for this population. Prey availability. Do they have enough of their Chinook salmon prey to eat? They live a long time and accumulate toxic contaminants throughout their lives that can cause immune function or reproductive issues. And then these are acoustic animals, so they can also be disturbed by vessels and noise that can interfere with their echolocation that they use to find fish or their communication, since they're such social animals. We've been working with the Center for Whale Research that does a census every year because each individual whale is identifiable, and I brought some trading cards for the southern resident killer whales, which is each member of the population with their dorsal fin and saddle patch photo and a conservation message and a fact about whales, so grab a couple of those on your way out. But because they're identifiable, the Center for Whale Research is able to do this annual census where we know exactly how many whales are in the population. Not even just every year, but kind of on an ongoing basis now, as everyone is keeping their eye out for southern residents. So this is the population trend. It was in that late 90s period when we saw this almost 20% population decline. And that's what prompted this endangered listing for this particular group of killer whales. And now, unfortunately, they've continued to decline, and we're only at 73 animals in this population. So it's very small, very much at risk, not just from these three main threats, which is we think involved in some of these declines we've seen, but they're also at risk for things like oil spills or a disease outbreak that could affect this population because they all get together in the same place at the same time. So that's just a little bit of background. We do have a recovery plan that was completed in 2008. And I'll say we even started implementing actions before the listing, before the recovery plan was done. We're very fortunate that in Washington State, Senator Cantwell has been a big supporter of southern resident killer whale research and conservation. So with some specific funding, we were able to kind of jumpstart the research program back to 2003. We were able to support some enforcement on the water to help protect the whales from those vessel impacts, and also do some education early on. And I'll say, this was dedicated to southern residents, and salmon recovery dates back even further with additional funds through grant programs and state and a lot of efforts going on that even started before the southern resident recovery efforts. Our recovery plan takes a broad approach to address all the threats. And it also takes an adaptive approach. So there's a whole section about research, data gaps, and how we link how those research projects and programs can tie into conservation and management. So there's a lot of crosswalking in this recovery plan. But yes, it's a decade old now, so it's still a great document. It has a lot of good background information, and all the actions are still relevant. But something that we've done more recently is to really focus in on what are some of those key actions that we wanted to take over a 5-year period. And so we did this a few years ago when NOAA started a program called Species in the Spotlight. So this was to highlight near-term actions to support recovery of species that were endangered, declining, and that we have some idea, we have a recovery plan that tells us what needs to be done. So southern residents have the dubious distinction of being on this list, and there's actually several runs of salmon that are on that list. On the west coast, we also have leatherback sea turtles and white abalone. So more than half of the 8 are here on our west coast, and gives us some indication. Some of these are connected through the food web about interactions of these species that are endangered and in need of special attention. So very similar fashion, we focused on the 3 main threats, and that comes out of the recovery plan, and we put our action plan for the Species in the Spotlight program together. So we wanted to target recovery of critical prey, investigate the contaminants and the health issues, protect whales from harmful vessel impacts, protect important habitats, and then raise awareness and inspire stewardship. So those are the 5 main parts of the program and this action plan. And I'll kind of walk through some of the latest things that have been happening, kind of point by point. But first I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening kind of outside NOAA's recovery program. And just to note that although not identified as those 3 big threats, we are working on oil spill response planning. Our program involves a lot of transboundary coordination because it's a transboundary species in US and Canadian waters. And then also there's some protections because they're listed under the Endangered Species Act, where we have to ensure that federal actions don't jeopardize the continued existence of endangered species and don't adversely modify or destroy critical habitat. So that's this ESA consultations piece. So we work with a lot of federal agencies to try to minimize the impacts of things that they're permitting or funding or carrying out. So just so to say that this action plan isn't our whole program, and it does include both research and some conservation management actions. So recently, one of the big things you may have heard about has been the governor's task force here in Washington State. And I think in the last 2 years, with the signing of an executive order, creation of this task force, it happened at the same time that there was a lot of media interest in the southern resident killer whales, a lot of new initiatives in Canada through their Ocean Protections Plan and their whale initiative, and by the whales themselves. In 2018, we saw J35 carry her calf. That's a photo from Soundwatch of that time. And then also we mounted an emergency response for a calf, J50, that we tried to remotely medicate before she disappeared. And then in 2019, new news of whales, some of whom we'd seen declining in condition, also leaving the population. But the good news is that there's 2 calves out there, so there's not all bad news in the media. There's a little ray of hope as well. I don't know if any of you guys followed Linda Mapes' articles, a series she did for the Seattle Times. There were big insets with full-page color photos and a lot of really detailed information. So a lot of intense media interest in the last couple of years. So that's really increased a lot of urgency and awareness about recovery of southern resident killer whales, which is good. So what did that amount to? Well, the task force, which I sat on, We also had working groups for each of the threats, and people on the working groups helped feed information up to the task force, which had about 50 members from all over Washington, federal, county, state agencies, industry, local elected officials, NGOs. It was a really diverse group, tribal representatives, and this group put together a report to the governor, to Governor Inslee, of 36 recommendations of actions to take. 16 were about prey, 10 about vessels, 10 for contaminants, and then out of those 36, there were 10 that would likely require some sort of state legislative change, some action in the legislature. And because this was a state task force, a lot of these actions were focused on things the state could do with their state agencies and their state jurisdiction, but not totally limited to the state as well. So out of those 10 that could be legislative, 4 bills were passed this year. So one was focused on habitat protection for salmon. We had one on toxic pollution that got passed, an oil spill prevention bill, and then also a vessel noise and disturbance bill that had some specifics to whale watching distances, creating a permit system for whale watching, things like that. So this was a success. This is kind of a big push. Some of these things, like the salmon habitat, are actions that a lot of groups have been wanting for many years, and it was really that urgency, awareness, support of the governor that got things through. There was also some funding initiatives. Certainly not everything was funded, and not every recommendation on the list has been fully implemented. It's a work in progress. And in fact, there was actually a year 2 for the task force. And this new report just came out recently, so this is one of these really new updates. And I'll say I really appreciated that the task force took on some very challenging topics. We took on climate change and human population growth in this region. And this is a lot of stuff that is underlying those threats and changes that people have made in the ecosystem. And not everyone always focuses on these because they're really hard and complicated. And so I really appreciate that we spent the time to get presentations from experts, to think through what could be done at the Washington state level, and how does that connect directly to southern resident killer whale recovery. There's also a section in this final report, because the task force is now done. That was one of the things that did not get funded to continue, but we did make a few recommendations to the governor of what could we do life after the task force, what could that look like to continue this momentum and support within Washington state and beyond for southern resident killer whale recovery. So we're waiting to hear back from Governor Inslee to see what he thinks about our suggestions and what structure might be best to continue some of that work. All right, so now I'm going to go through those main topic areas. This is an amazing photo from our team that uses drones, UAVs, to take aerial shots. This is a fairly robust looking whale chasing fish. So I like that photo.
Can you guys see on that side?
Did you see that? Yeah, so I said we want to target recovery of critical prey. So how are we doing that? What are some of the things we're working on? Well, one is to plug in and work with the existing salmon recovery infrastructure and effort, which I will say is much better funded than the recovery effort for southern resident killer whales alone. So helping coordinate, we've had a lot of internal strategy discussions within NOAA, because we work on things like salmon fisheries and hatcheries and habitat programs and hydropower. And so a lot of discussions of how can NOAA be more coordinated ourselves and combine those salmon recovery and conservation and management actions to benefit the southern resident killer whales. We've also done a lot of joint workshops and events and presentations where we're really trying to bring those two communities together. So how many people here would consider themselves in the southern resident killer whale recovery community? All right, probably almost everybody. Okay, how many people here feel like they're part of Chinook salmon or salmon recovery or habitat as well? See, that's almost everybody. They're so connected, and it's really heartening to see that, because we need to work together. So bringing those two communities together to learn more about how we can make the most of our salmon recovery efforts to benefit the whales. And one of the things that we've been working on to help with that effort is to prioritize which stocks of Chinook salmon do we think are most important to the southern residents, or do we think can fill gaps where they might be food limited, different spaces in time. And so we've talked about kind of long-term recovery goals and how do we plug in with salmon recovery plans and the actions identified there. And we've also met with a lot of colleagues, including across the border. This was a report from a workshop that our Canadian colleagues hosted that was to look at more of the short-term actions that could be taken to make the prey that's out there now more available to the whales. So we got to work on two different time scales. Long-term, like habitat restoration, is going to take a long time so we can rebuild salmon stocks. But there's other things we could do short-term. Some of those may include things like increasing hatchery production or having protected areas or fishing adjustments so that more of the salmon that's out there is available to the whales. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those things. But first I just wanted to introduce this Priority Chinook Stocks Report. So this was NOAA Fisheries and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we used the best available information from our research programs to look at what do we know, what's observed in the diet of the whales. That's from prey sampling, scale sampling, fecal analysis that tells us where and when the whales are eating different species of Chinook, or different species of salmon like Chinook, or exactly what runs of Chinook the whales are eating. We also looked at the body condition information from that photogrammetry, that's drone photography, to see at what times of year do we think the whales might have that prey limitation. We've seen them be, in some of the whales, particularly J-pod, in kind of better condition at the end of the summer, in September. And then they have to go through the winter and they're in poor condition when they're photographed in May. So that helps us understand where and when that food limitation might be occurring. And we also looked at the degree of overlap between what we know about the southern residents. Again, a lot of great research information on tagging from acoustic recorders and also sightings of where the whales are. And then as much information as we can possibly pull together on where different runs of Chinook salmon are and where do they overlap in space and time. And that actually got the highest weight in our model here, pulling all this information together. Where we think they overlap, because our sample sizes are still small on ocean in the winter of exactly what the whales are eating. And how now we can use this to put a model together to assign different weights and put out a list of priority stocks for the southern residents. And using that list, we can then inform how we evaluate fisheries, for example, or other actions that impact Chinook salmon. I talked about those ESA consultations for federal actions. A lot of federal actions affect salmon. We also are in ongoing discussions with the co-managers. So for example, Washington State and our local Indian tribes. They are co-managers of the salmon resources. And for example, they're working on a long-term fishing management plan for Puget Sound fisheries. So we're using this priority prey information to help in those conversations. We're also using this priority stock list to prioritize actions for a couple different grant programs. One is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWIF. They have a program for killer whale research and conservation. And that also includes actions for salmon. And so we wanted to prioritize those salmon actions that are for those priority prey stocks. There's also PCSRF, that's the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. And that's purely to support state and tribe and local salmon recovery efforts. And so if we can give a little bit of a higher priority to the projects that are going to benefit not just those runs of Chinook salmon, but also the whales, we're getting that multi-species benefit, kind of better bang for our buck. It's a good investment of that grant money. I mentioned we're also looking at short-term strategies. to increase availability of prey, so that stock priority list helps with those as well. And then one more working group that we've got pulled together, and this is fairly new as well, is with the PFMC, the Pacific Fishery Management Council. We have an ad hoc working group that we pulled together through the council to evaluate how our coastal salmon fishery is affecting the prey base for the whales. So again, that's informed by all this new information about what the whales are eating, where they're going, and what Chinook they overlap with. All right, so we'll talk about contaminants and health, another beautiful photo. So just a little bit of background. These southern residents are at the top of the food chain, that bioaccumulation of contaminants, things that we don't even use in the US anymore, like PCBs and DDTs. Also things that are still in use, the flame retardants, PBDEs, are out there. And so we really need to better understand how those are moving through the food chain up into the whales and what levels can cause those reproductive or immune function problems for the whales. On the management action side, we've been working closely with the Puget Sound Partnership that's working on a kind of a vision to clean up and restore Puget Sound. They had some actions by 2020. I'm guessing at some point they're going to reevaluate that time frame. We're also working with EPA and with some Washington state agencies. And coming out of one of those ESA consultations I mentioned, it was for wastewater treatment at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Who's ever gotten stuck in that traffic? Yeah, there's a lot of people there, and so when they redid their wastewater treatment, because it was a federal facility, we had that connection to ESA to think about how does it affect the listed salmon and also the southern resident killer whales. And we identified some gaps in our knowledge, particularly about those PBDEs, the flame retardants, and how that goes through the wastewater treatment plants, what are the potential effects of those contaminants on the whales. And so this helped us identify some monitoring actions that can be put in place for different plants and different stormwater type outfalls that are out there. And I think it's helping us weave some of that monitoring and some of that filling of data gaps into those federal projects that we get a chance to look at. We've also had a number of southern resident killer whale health workshops where we've brought together our veterinarian expertise, pathologists from both sides of the border, to really discuss, what do we need to do to better understand and address the decreased reproduction we've seen in southern resident killer whales compared to other populations, like the northern residents, and also what's causing increased mortality. So learning a lot from stranded animals that come ashore that we're able to do a full necropsy and testing. That's really a valuable opportunity for us to learn as much as we can about causes of death and what these whales are facing in their environment. We're also collecting samples from the whales that are out there swimming. So this is Tucker. He's retired now, but he's one of those conservation canines that University of Washington uses to smell for whale scat on the water. So these dogs help us find the scat on the water so the researchers can collect those fecal samples. Wealth of information in whale poop. We also are using breath sampling to understand some of those pathogens that might be in their respiratory tract. Also the telemetry and photogrammetry to understand health and how that changes over time with declining condition or with pregnancy and increased condition. And we've been identifying kind of animals of interest. When we see something unusual or see a whale that's declining, that gives us an opportunity to focus our efforts to learn more about what's happening with that whale. And we do try to coordinate all our research activities so that we're not causing more impacts on these kind of compromised animals, but we can collect some information to help us understand what's going on. And also assessing prey changes, looking at that body condition and blubber content. So I'd say we're really a little more focused still on the research side and filling in data gaps to help us address some of these health issues and how contaminants are affecting the health of the whales. All right, so let's talk about vessels. So in the action plan, we were talking about protecting whales from vessel impacts through things like enforcement, education, and also we want to evaluate the protections that we do put in place to see if they're working. So just a little background, I mentioned earlier that the killer whales are using echolocation to find food, and what a beautiful illustration of echolocation.
I need an updated one.
Yeah, I'll take it. You
All
got an
right.
extra updated one? All right, to communicate, navigate, and find food. So in 2011, so here's the old history, NOAA put in place some federal vessel regulations, which prohibit approach closer than 200 yards, and also prohibit being in the path of the whales out to 400 yards. So this is a fairly simple diagram of those specific federal regulations. This past year, we had a lot of changes. Canada and Washington State adjusted their distances and added some speed limits, that some were voluntary, some were regulatory. So our diagram's a little more complicated now, and it depends on what side of the border you're on.
This is Canadian one.
Well, no, this is everything. We tried to put it all together. So, in the U.S., under Washington state law, you have to stay 300 yards on the side of the whales and stay out 400 yards in front and back. It's kind of like a bow tie shape. And then Canada had a 400-meter rule for all killer whales. They also had an agreement with the Pacific Whale Watch Association so that if they avoided doing southern resident viewing, they were able to not stay at that 400-meter limit, but go to 200 meters to view transient killer whales. So that we didn't even try to capture that on this side. And then we've got a guideline for 7 knots and a law under the Washington State for a 7-knot speed limit within a half-mile of the orcas. So one of the things we're really working on is trying to align between Washington State, Canada, and the U.S. feds. So we're working on it. I've been making a lot of trips to Canada. So we're also working on a lot of education enforcement. Soundwatch and Straightwatch are out there monitoring the voter compliance with these rules. And there's also an ongoing active research program, like our Science Center's DTEC project, to really tease out what is it about vessels that can affect the whale's behavior, and particularly foraging. If you go to the boat show, we'll have a booth. Be Whale Wise, come check us out.
That was fun.
Yeah. So just a little bit on enforcement. This is something we definitely have invested in, and we're happy to see Washington State invest, because NOAA's been providing some ESA Section 6 Endangered Species grant money to WDFW to be out there on the water doing patrols. So we hope that'll continue, and we'll even have more enforcement, because this is data from Soundwatch showing the number of incidents, and that's when a boat is observed not following the rules or guidelines. How often does that happen when Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Enforcement is on scene? That's the red, or when they're not present, that's the blue. So you can see, and it's not really surprising, when enforcement is out there, people follow the rules more often. So that's really a good way for us to increase protections for the whales.
Lynn, are there data beyond 2015?
Yes. I just don't have a more recent figure. But yeah, Soundwatch continues to collect this data, and that,
The trend continues.
yeah, yep, it's probably one of the strongest results. I think is really powerful. I mean, I know I slow down when I see a police car on the side of the highway, so it makes a lot of sense, but it's great to have the data to really support that and show it. So it's not all about enforcement and busting people or writing tickets. We have a lot of voluntary efforts that complement the regulations we have in place. We've got this no boat zone on the west side of San Juan Island, and in 2018 and 2019, we actually expanded it. It used to end over here, and now in partnership with the state, with San Juan County, this is part of their marine stewardship area, and with the Whale Watch Association, there was agreement to extend that to another important foraging area, and do additional outreach and education about that no-go zone. We also have a whale warning flag that San Juan County has spearheaded. There's something similar up in Canada. It's kind of like a diver down flag. When this is flying, people are learning that that means the whales are somewhere nearby and that they should slow down, they should keep an eye out, and they should be sure to follow the rules. And then I think recently the Whale Watch Association has also put additional measures in their industry guidelines, things like limiting the time spent with the whales, particularly southern residents. So a lot of good voluntary measures in place as well. Okay, so not just US, but here's Canada's complicated figure. Yeah, so for 2019, they put out an emergency order to help protect the whales. It included that 400-meter approach distance, but it also included some interim sanctuary zones. These are in yellow at Swiftsure Bank and Pender and Saturna Islands. They also did some fishery closures. Some were mandatory, some were voluntary. And I think they expanded their critical habitat as well more recently. So just a number of different types of protections. Again, some mandatory, some voluntary. But this was just an interim order, so this was just for 2019, and it expired at the end of October. So we'll see what Canada has in store for 2020. And we'll try to keep in touch with them and see where we can find alignment, and also see what we can learn from their experience of implementing their interim orders and implementing the, we have the new state in 2019 as well. So yeah, a lot going on.
Do you think the U.S. would ever implement fishery closures? Okay.
We can talk about that, but first I'll also talk about another voluntary measure, and this is industry-led from the Port of Vancouver in Canada and their ECHO program, which is Enhancing Cetacean Habitat and Observation. That's what ECHO stands for. So they've been doing, working with the shipping industry in the shipping lanes, which happen to be right along the border between the US and Canada, and the shipping lane for the boats going to Vancouver happens to go right along that west side of San Juan Island, important foraging area. So they've been working with the industry, and they've done slowdown trials. And so most recently, they reviewed the very first pilot data from 2017 and 2018 in Harrow Strait, and found that it did reduce the noise. And in 2019, they expanded the area, and they adjusted the speeds to be a little more sensitive to what the capabilities of some of the different types of ships and boats were. So it was an expanded area through Boundary Pass as well. And they have an adaptive turning on at the beginning of the season and turning off at the end of the season based on whale presence. So they can't turn this on every day or every hour as whales are there or not. We just don't quite have that infrastructure yet to be able to do that in real time. But they do have an adaptive opening and start at the beginning and end of the season. And I think because of the data showing that this has helped reduce noise, one of the recommendations in the task force year one report was to consider something similar in the US, kind of an Echo South program. So we've had our first meeting with Coast Guard, with the ports of Seattle and Tacoma, with a whole host of pilots and cruise ship folks were there to really start thinking. Fred Fellman was there leading the charge for the Port of Seattle to talk about what's going on for boats that are headed to Seattle and Tacoma, and is this something we could think about, and that.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
Were they also testing emissions? Because I know that there's been some work with the International IMO,
Maritime
Thank you.
Organization, yeah.
Looking at slowing down vessels in a way to reduce emissions. So I'm just wondering if that was part of what was being tested during ECHO.
Not specifically, but that's definitely another. So this is just one measure for ECHO. They have a whole, I would recommend you check out their website. They have a whole bunch of other things that are about ship quieting, looking for those kind of mutual benefits of saving energy and also but it changes the amount of time, but it could affect emissions as well. So there's a whole host of different measures and education and outreach programs for professional mariners that are part of the ECHO program as well. But I think this is just one of the most kind of bold things that they've done.
You can always check the website too, but do you know if they notice any like them saving fuel by going slower, or like if they're gonna say it affected their wait times in port?
There is some data on the times. For example, they spend more time, and if they go over a certain time trigger, they have to have a second pilot on board, and that costs quite a bit of money. So they are looking at some of the economic, some of the kind of mutual benefits of slowing down, not just the noise reduction, but also looking at the costs for the industry, that additional time. And I think this is one of the ultimate questions that we don't have a great answer. What's better for the whales? Less sound for a longer time, or higher sound for a shorter time? Or no sound, you know. That I think we probably know. Did you have a question as well?
Yes, I did. Do you know if there has been a determination whether or not ferries and barges both have equal impact of the whales, or is there any research in regard to that?
There's a ton. So one of the things ECHO has done is plant a super high-tech hydrophone and had different types of vessels pass over it at different speeds, and match that with their VTS track data, and so that they can look at what are the sounds for specific vessels, types of vessels, different speeds. They have a whole wealth of information about that. And we had some surprising reports from, for example, some of the British Columbia ferries. They're sort of, they're built to have an optimum speed. And so there were some cases where they slowed down and it was actually louder. Yeah. So, and Washington State Ferries is doing some similar work to understand their sound signatures as well.
Yes, and I work on the Washington State Ferries in Anacortes, and one of the things, our main speed that we generally go at is about 16 knots, 15 to 16 knots. And from what I can understand, from what I've seen, we've seen much less orcas this year and the previous year than I've ever seen since starting working on the Washington State Ferries.
Yeah, there has been quite a change in the last few years in sightings and distribution of the whales, particularly in the summer months. And I think we've seen the whales actually come down further south earlier in the season this year than in past years. So just when we think we've got their patterns figured out, you know, things change and we have more to learn. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see as we move forward kind of what parallels we have and what capabilities, and working with industry I think is a really positive way to go, to think about, are there voluntary measures, and they've had really high compliance with these ECHO slowdown trials, and like 80%. And is that something we can achieve, a sound reduction and improvement in a voluntary way versus a regulatory way? But lots of great conversations happening there. All right, so what's NOAA doing? So now that our vessel regulations don't match anyone else's, we're considering, do we need to revisit? Do we need to revisit those protections we have in place? And so we've got a Federal Register notice that's out right now. We're accepting comments through December 23rd. So here's the link to the Federal Register notice. We had a public meeting in Friday Harbor on the 12th. And we've got an email address set up, or you can mail comments to me. That's my address. You can put my name on there if you want. They'll still find their way to me. And so this is helping us scope what types of changes we might want to consider, what different alternatives are out there, and we really just want to hear from people. So we had a really good turnout at our Friday Harbor meeting. At least one person was there. Lots of good public comment. 2 people, yes, a couple people.
I just would say, if anyone is interested in watching that meeting, I'd be happy to give you the link to the video that I have for it, if anyone wants to see the comments. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No worries. So you've still got plenty of time to think about what might be a good suggestion for us to consider. Okay, so protecting important habitats is another piece of our Species in the Spotlight action plan. And again, there's another opportunity for you to think about critical habitat for southern resident killer whales. So here's the history part. In 2006, about a year after the listing, we designated over 2,500 square miles in inland waters. So it's the San Juan Islands, kind of core summer feeding area, into Puget Sound, and then that travel corridor, but we know they're eating there as well, in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And we identified what are those physical and biological features, those elements of the habitat that are important for the whales, and we identified water quality, prey, and passage as the important things that we want to protect for the whale's habitat. And at that time, back in 2006, we did not know very much at all about what the whales were doing off the coast. So this is what we limited our first critical habitat designation to. And in the meantime, our colleagues at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, where Candy works, have been busy at work collecting information to help us understand that coastal use for southern residents. We also got a petition from NGOs saying, hey, you guys have been collecting this information. We think it's time. You probably have enough to revise your critical habitat. So we looked at that petition, we agreed, yes, we have a lot of new information, and we accepted that petition and put out a finding that said, and here's our steps we're going to go through to create a proposal to amend the critical habitat. And the next step is a proposed rule, and that just came out in September, and is another opportunity for public comments right now. And I'll give you those details in a second. So what's in our proposal? So based on that really valuable information from satellite tagging, from passive acoustic monitoring, visual sightings, we have a much better understanding of the range of the whales along the coast, and also what are those features. And probably not surprisingly, similar features in the coastal habitat of prey and water quality and passage. And then we look at the different areas. So we've got 6 specific areas here, 2 kind of off Washington coast, and then 4 more, and we've identified kind of what's the primary feature, what do we know most about how the whales are using that specific area. Is it a feeding area where we've collected samples from foraging, or is it more of a passage corridor where they're more directional travel, not as much milling? And so we've described those different areas and where we think those features are and which one's most important for each area. So this is the map. We also have to go through a weighing process under Section 4B2 of the Endangered Species Act to look at what are the benefits to the whales of proposing certain areas and for conservation, but also what are the impacts to national security or economics or other important things like tribes and their lands, things like that. So as part of this proposal, we have proposed to exclude a military area. Part of the Quinault Range overlaps off the Washington coast. And working with the Navy, they gave us information about how they thought critical habitat could affect national security. I will say, even though we're proposing this, we still have to look at how those Navy activities affect the whales themselves. We just don't have to do the additional analysis for critical habitat. So that comment period is open till December 18th. Again, lots of time to review the biological report. We didn't exclude anything based on economics, and we have a whole economic report to support that, and a 4B2 report that goes through details of what the Navy provided to us and that balancing of costs and impacts, or benefits and impacts from designating certain areas. And the easiest way to comment is probably to go to regulations.gov and just Google killer whales. But if you Google critical habitat, you might get 2 responses, because in a similar area along the West Coast, actually a much larger area, we're also proposing to designate critical habitat for humpback whales. And we can talk about that if someone has questions too.
Be a separate meeting.
Yeah, we could do a
Is
whole
there,
separate humpback whale.
Is there anything you can say in particular about how the ESA applies in terms of military? Anything in particular? I just never looked into it.
Yeah, so for example, a lot of people are interested in the Navy training and testing that happens off the Washington coast and in Puget Sound. So the Navy has to go through the process of getting ESA and MMPA, Marine Mammal Protection Act, authorization for their activities. So that's that ESA consultation with the federal action that I mentioned earlier. So we work with them to minimize their impacts as much as we can, or to authorize impacts to marine mammals if they're unavoidable. And so under the ESA, there's sort of two parts of that evaluation. One is, how do those activities impact the species? How are whales impacted by Navy activities, or something else, like something that affects the fish? And also, how does that affect critical habitat? And as I mentioned, water quality and prey and passage are features of critical habitat. And I'll let you know that we are already looking at those pathways for effects to the whales themselves. So when we look at how does Navy or a fishing activity or something affect southern resident killer whales, we already consider, oh, how does it affect their prey? Or would it affect their distribution and their movements? Or would it affect water quality and contaminants that go up the food chain? So adding a critical habitat that has those same pathways for effects, we'll do a separate analysis, but we really don't expect that we would have to do any additional changes to projects to minimize impacts for critical habitat alone compared to the baseline protections that we already have for the whales themselves. Does that make sense? I see a couple nodding. Okay, good. It's complicated, but so that's part of the protections of the ESA and critical habitat.
Thank you.
Sure. And there's a ton of information in the supporting documents for the proposal.
I just get this feeling like it might be a bit of a dicker between you and these, the defense, because if you're kind of having to watchdog them with, how much enforcement is there really for ESA against Navy?
They've got some pretty specific protocols and reporting that they do through their ESA and MMPA compliance and reporting. And they take it very seriously, the monitoring they have in place to avoid impacts. It's been subject of lawsuits, so there's a lot of scrutiny. Yeah. All right, so I talked a lot about what's happening at the state and with Canada and what NOAA's doing. I also just thought I would share with you a little bit more about, what you guys can do. You're here, you're interested, you're learning, I love it. And I just gave you 2 opportunities to provide public comments on actions NOAA's taking, on the scoping for vessel protections, and then also critical habitat proposal. We already heard earlier about Whale Scout. Volunteering on a habitat restoration project in your watershed is a way to have a great hands-on experience, get your hands dirty on something that helps the salmon recovery, and then also orca recovery. You hear a lot about dams and how that affects salmon and how that affects whales, so conserving your water use is a way to protect salmon. Contaminants are another issue, so how you use different products, rain gardens, what you plant, how you minimize runoff or dispose of things, maintain your vehicles, some things that people can do every day. Choosing sustainable seafood. Fishwatch.gov has a great set of recommendations for making sustainable choices. Visit bewhalewise.org if you want to dive in and learn more about those complicated and specific rules in different places. It's a great way to brush up on the rules and regulations if you're headed out on the water. Or you could watch whales from shore. That's another alternative. We work with the Whale Trail to identify land-based viewing sites. So lots of options. If you see something, you can say something. We have reporting for enforcement through our bewhalewise.org. There's a report violations. We also have a 1-800 number, and it's on our Be Whale Wise brochures if you want to grab one of those. And also reporting those stranded, injured, or dead animals. If we can get to a stranding response quickly, we can learn so much about what's happening with the whales. And it's worth it, even if we get calls that we think it's something, but maybe it's not. Our stranding network can go check it out. So getting those reports is really valuable. And reporting sightings as well. There's plenty of ways. Orca Network, the Whale Museum has reporting. There's a whale report system in Canada. So lots of ways to share your kind of citizen science information. And then we also have some other things on our website for more details. We have a whole nother similar list for salmon, but I just wanted to share that with you guys and say it's not just the federal government, it's something we all need to work on. We need to partner, we need to be aware of how our choices as consumers and commuters affects the environment and the salmon and the whales. Yeah.
I have a question, for reporting odor violations, is there like a statute of limitations or like a time frame for reporting, like,
No, I think sooner is better, but
not like 5 years?
well, it'll go in the record and just kind of tracking how many reports we get. It really is difficult for our enforcement agency or agents to investigate depending on what information comes in. If there's photographs or a boater registration number, that's really valuable information. And we always have an agent on duty, so if it's something you see happening right now, you can call the 1-800 number and, you know, if so happens we have some enforcement out on the water or somebody can check it out, that's another avenue. Yeah.
You know about this, but for those of you, if any of you guys are boating out in the San Juan Islands, the WPFW and the San Juan County Sheriff's Department also offer a class on how to accurately report so they offer that usually once a year.
Cool.
San Juan and they'll be open.
Thanks, that's great. Well, I think that was what I wanted to share with you guys tonight, so if there's any more questions.
We have some time for questions, and then I'll get Joe give a little bit of a spiel.
So, first off, I just like to commend you for all your efforts that you've done with Southern Riders in the past. That's really great. But I have a two-part question. So, the Center for Whale Research reports that in order to grow the population by at least 140 whales, they require 1 million salmon per year. And currently, estimates have been made that they need 547,000 salmon just to survive. So what would it take to set aside that 547,000 from the annual harvest allotment each year? And the other part of my question was the last recovery plan estimated a cost of around $49 million. And I was wondering if a similar cost analysis has been done for the current efforts of conservation.
Okay, good questions. All right, let's do the second one first. So while we estimated that was over the first decade of recovery would cost about $50 million, do you think we got $50 million for southern resident killer whale recovery? No. So we've been trying to kind of focus on what we think is most important to get done first, to fill data gaps, to help inform management actions. And we haven't been able to do everything. And we did not do a similar cost estimate, for example, for the species in the Spotlight Plan. But we did put out a report, gosh, back in 2014, that walked through kind of the first 10 years of this program and also included some information about how we spent that money, what research projects we focused on, what management actions. So if you're interested in the money side, that'll give you an idea of how much we actually got, about $1 million a year, and how we spent it. Okay, so then the first part of the question was about fish and how many the whales need. Well, let me ask you a question. Those numbers about how many fish the whales need, do you think that many fish are out in the water?
Well, obviously no.
Actually, yes. There are more than that number of fish out in the water. But the whales can't get to every one of those Chinook salmon. There are probably over 1 million, some years over 2 million salmon out there. So really it's complicated to understand where and when those fish need to be there to be available for the whales. So it's really hard to just say the whales for metabolics need 500,000 fish. Let's put 500,000 fish aside for the whales, because we don't know kind of exactly where and when those fish need to be in place. So it's a complicated question. And the fisheries models that look at how many fish they think are out there, what's the abundance of Chinook, how many fish are taken by fisheries, those models also have a factor that includes natural mortality. Natural mortality includes fish that are eaten by whales. So in a way, And I don't know that it's completely accurate and, that reflection, but the fishery management, in a way, does kind of set aside, here's what the predators in the system are taking as part of this abundance, natural mortality, fishing takes, and then how many fish make it back to the rivers. And I think that's even the right, if I did that in the right order. Because there's some estimates out there that all the predators are probably taking more Chinook salmon than the fisheries currently are. And there's also, there's a lot of natural mortality. So did that answer your question?
Thank you.
Great, all right, thank you.
So one of the things that you guys mentioned, and one of the main things that NOAA does is they go and collect fecal matter from the orcas much of the year. So my wonder is, through research, scientists have determined that orcas are not only diurnal, but they are also nocturnal. So with that in mind, has there been any determination in regard to whether or not the fecal matter that they produce is conducive to them eating more at night versus during the day, and can we correlate that to the amount of ship traffic during the day as opposed to during the night?
So the fecal matter part, I'm gonna set aside for a second.
Okay.
Night and day, I'm not sure how we could get at that, although but the DTAG project that our Northwest Fisheries Science Center is working on, right now their focus, and they're collaborating with DFO in Canada, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, is to put tags, these suction cup tags on the whales that track their movements and their dives and record their foraging and when it's successful and when it's not. They're trying to get overnight deployments to really help understand how is foraging different day and night, and how is the acoustic environment different with vessels day and night. So I think our goals of that project will help get at some of what you're asking.
Right, and I just did a little bit of research just now, and it says, according to Camille, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing this, Camille Bajin-Marchand, it takes generally about 15 to 18 hours of digestion from mouth to anus in digestion time. I don't know how accurate that information is, but if we were to be able to come up with relatively the same amount of information for orcas, we'd be able to figure out when they eat the most. So,
We don't get all the poop.
yeah.
We're getting a tiny amount of poop that happens to be toward the surface. So I don't think I think it would be really tough to know how much they're defecating and when.
There's this wonderful cartoon where you see these whales fluking up. You see these scientists there with their little collector bucket, right?
Did you drop a cartoon?
Over here.
About the Canadian regulations, voting regulations, so obviously it's all up in the air, but it's expired. In the meantime, as far as sharing with the public and educating, we're starting to get questions about that. When posting, just stick with the 2019 or reverts back to prior?
And I should have said this, so those were interim rules, the 400 meters. They do have a nationwide approach restriction of 200 meters for all cetaceans.
Yes.
So that's in place all year.
So
that's the default
people,
that people should know about.
Clarification.
Yes, that's in place right now.
Okay.
And then we'll see kind of if they do something different for 2020 on an interim basis, on a long-term basis.
Okay.
For humpbacks also, 200?
It's all cetaceans, 200-meter approach rule. And it's relatively new. I think 2018 was the first year after working on it for about a decade. They got that. Well, it's hard to do something nationwide. Believe me, I know. We've tried and it's been really difficult.
Okay, so we need to change back all the...
Yes, so I believe there was a Be Whale Wise meeting yesterday that I did not get to participate in, where that was one of the things they were going to talk about is, can we update the website so it accurately reflects in real time the changes to the rules. So I would say stay tuned or check Be Whale Wise. There should be some updates. We probably won't get brochures printed out right away, and we'll wait to learn what's going on.
No, it would be amazing to have it, really cool to have it be exactly the same as the Canadian counterparts or vice versa.
It would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we have a question.
Can you speak to genetic bottlenecking risks with the smaller size of the population?
A little bit, yeah. So we have to do periodic kind of status updates on how the southern residents are doing, and are we meeting our recovery goals? No, that's the short answer. And so the last time we did that, we worked with our colleagues at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and they looked at inbreeding. And in addition to kind of the poor reproduction we've seen, if you add that inbreeding in as well, the population decline is a little more, yeah, it happens a little quicker. So there is some impact there, and we're working with a new company, and I don't know, Candy, I can't remember what they're called, but it's to do the full genome for the southern resident killer whales. It is. It's a Chinese genetics company that does, endangered animals all over the world, and to map the full genome. And I think it's going to be really valuable to help us understand that inbreeding effect. Is it tied to something that, like immune function or reproduction or growth or survival? So gene expression, yep. All kinds of cool stuff.
Mike Ford be giving any more talks coming up on that? Because he's studying genes, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't.
We've had him once or twice, I think.
So those are actually, all those samples, like Lynne said, are being analyzed by this Chinese company.
Mike's not continuing.
Wait, no, he's not collecting other people's samples.
Yeah. I just wondered maybe she could catch Mike Ford if she had, maybe
He's at the North Center.
bring him lunch and he'll talk.
He does have.
And you should look at his paternity papers, because it's really interesting to learn who the dads are.
We'll get out of here.
Or just pick up some cards. We've tried to add paternity to the trading cards
cool.
where we know it.
Ah.
So that's an update in the latest version.
Who's your daddy? Go daddy. Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you,
I
Candy.
have a quick question.
Is there a number where this population would be considered biologically extinct? I know, 73 sounds really close.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to look at that. There's kind of a quasi-extinction level, and looking at just reproductive age females, or the functional population level. Yeah. So it depends on exactly what you're looking at, but we have looked at that. And for me, what also I'm looking at is kind of when hopefully we don't dip lower or have fewer reproductive age females compared to when we first started studying the population. So right now, we still have enough reproductive potential. It's similar to what we saw the population increase from in the past. So for me, that's also kind of a landmark, is if we do go below that, there's a lot more uncertainty. We haven't seen what could happen if they're able to come back from an even lower number. 73 is a very small number. And even if we meet our recovery goals, kind of big picture is that they're likely to always be a small population, and they may always have been a fairly small population. So just kind of keeping those population dynamics in mind.
A few more questions?
I was curious if you know if there's anyone who's looked at, so if we're taking all this biomass out in terms of Chinook mostly or whatever other salmon, what is that, what kind of a void does that leave in terms of that biomass? Because if predators eat those fish and then defecate, then that feeds the system and so forth. Is anyone looking at that at
There's
all?
some paper about how the poop is valuable in the ecosystem. It's new, I haven't read it yet.
It's new?
Researcher wants to talk and didn't get him to do that whole.
Yeah, there's at least, I think in the last month or last few weeks, that's talked about kind of the economics of that question.
Do you know where it came out of roughly? The United States? Or, don't know.
Australia, yeah. So yes, someone is looking at that. But I will also add that we may be taking a lot of Chinook biomass. We're also putting a lot into the system with our hatchery programs. So just something else to keep in mind. That is, some of them are intended for the fisheries, but also have the other consequence of feeding lots of predators. So.
This kind of goes back to the Canadian protection zones. I don't I don't claim to know everything about where the southern residents feed, but it seemed like there were some areas in Canada that were closed off saying it was critical foraging habitat when I've never heard of them actually eating there. Do you know, like, I mean, this is more like a DFO question, but do you know if they're gonna like make more closures, if there's any way that we would like know about it, be able to give feedback to make sure that the places they're gonna close off for foraging are actually places that we eat?
They're ramping up their research program to get more data. So that's one thing they're working on. They're also evaluating kind of the whale use last year of those areas, and I think they had a lot more use at Swiftsure than they did at the other two sites. So it's something that they're thinking about, and they're gonna create, or they're gonna continue this technical working group process they've had to help inform those interim measures last year. So, and I believe they've done public comment as well as part of that process. So stay tuned for, I think they're gonna kick that off again in January for May measures. It's gonna be a fast and furious review of what happened last year and thinking about what to do this year.
How many breeding age females are left in the population, and how many of those, what percentage of the females is that now compared to like 15 or 20 years ago?
I wanna say 23, but.
And what percentage of the total female population is that?
Well, I think that's like
Is it
breeding
about
age.
50%?
No.
What age they stop reproducing at 45, 50?
Yeah, they're reproductive kind of 12 to 15 to 45. They have a 25-year reproductive span till about 40, and then
And then comparing what percentage now of breeding age compared to what was in the population 20 years ago, has there been a marked decrease, or is it about the same?
I think
It's about the same.
The problem is that a lot of these reproductive females aren't actually having.
yes.
That's why I was wondering.
Yeah,
because
so
we're seeing
it
a
is about the same
decrease.
number.
Right. So
Breeding
I
age
was
is
wondering if
different.
it's actually that we're having more in the menopausal phase, or if we were just having lower reproductive levels.
Lower reproductive levels for those reproductive age females, yeah.
One more question.
Mm-hmm.
What's your feeling about whether hatchery fish are a strain or an issue, a problem for wild fish?
Yeah, so I've been having a lot of internal conversations with the NOAA team that manages and reviews the hatchery genetic management plans. They look at how hatchery programs can affect threatened and endangered runs of salmon. And so we've had a lot of talk about being smart with any hatchery adjustments. And I'm not just gonna say, increased hatchery production, but could we adjust some hatchery production so that it maybe fills the gap for southern residents, particularly, and also, can we make sure that the hatchery, if we are doing increases that we're investing in, are not going to cause further issues for endangered or threatened runs of salmon? So there's different hatchery programs that are done for different reasons, that have different levels of impacts on wild fish, and so that's part of the decision-making process. Does it check the ESA box? Does it check the feasibility box? Does it check the priority to fill gaps for southern residents before making a decision to fund a hatchery increase or a change in hatchery production? So we have to be smart about it.
You think it's worth looking into, and you have
Yes.
faith that it could possibly work?
Yes.
With that, I'm going to have to, because I wanted to give Joe a little bit of a chance to announce his. Lynne, thank you so much. Before I hand over the word to, thank you, Lynne, appreciate it. So before I hand over the word to Joe here, who's going to have some proposal to talk about.
Well, thanks so much, Lynn. It's really great to hear Lynn. Known you for a long time. And, perfect segue for what I want to talk about is to get everybody involved in being able to do something for the whales. And some of you have already heard, like Peggy's already heard, so she's walking out on me.
I love you and I support this 100%. I have to go.
I think she already commented on your Facebook.
No, so Peggy knows. So a few of you already know what's going on, but I want to get everybody possible, tens of thousands of people, motivated and mobilized to do things for the orcas. And so I want to put on a Live Aid style concert event. And I've kind of dived into this, and I'm going to need a lot of help doing it. Because my area of expertise is building hydrophones and putting on parties a long time ago. So this is going to be a big world party. So in order to get big acts, it's got to be something that's going to have worldwide appeal, not just for orcas. Because even though everybody around here cares about the orcas, people in California they don't realize they have what they do has an effect on this population of killer whales. So I want this to happen at the end of summer or early fall at CenturyLink Field or T-Mobile Park. So big arena, big famous stars, and the admission is going to be free. So everything has to be volunteer. And I'm going to take this as far to the goal line as I can with no money changing hands. And if I have to, then look for government grants or corporate donations. But as far as I can go, that's how far I want to go. So I need people with connections to anybody. Anybody in power, anybody that owns stadiums, the hours, any of that, right? But the admission, though, is a commitment to doing something for the local ecosystem. Here, it would be particularly for the orcas. And doing at least 3 things. That's 3 lifestyle changes, 3 activities, 3 consistent activities. So that's where all the nonprofit organizations that are doing work with the orcas and the government organizations need to be present at this event as well, so that they can educate the people specifically on what they can do. The education now it's been going on for 20 years. The orcas in trouble, the 3 causes. It's 20 years now this has been going on. And the first orca recovery conference that I put together was in 2001, in the spring of 2001. So it's really time for action. And the government's doing what the government can do, and that's great, but we need people to do everything that the government can't do. So that's why I need all the other organizations there to say, here's Whale Scout, we're going out and we're restoring streams, right? Every organization that can help. So anybody that's interested in helping out, please do. If you're not interested in helping out, that's fine, but if you are in an organization that does work for the ecosystem, then you have to be at this event. I mean, you have to, because not only are you, by not paying anything, so the normal cycle is that we raise money for nonprofit organizations, so the nonprofit organizations can mobilize people to do something. This bypasses the money-raising phase. It's a direct action. But during that, the organizations will gain membership, and they will also gain donations from the people who want to do something. So I see it as a geometric expansion on what could be done. And I've got a few flyers here, or little one-page, one-sheet things. I've got 10 of them if anybody's interested. I can hand it out to you. I set up a new email address just through my company right now. I don't know, I've got to talk to ACS about doing something maybe through the nonprofit. But right now it's just me doing it, but it's going to, I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. So that's it.
All right.
2020, yeah, 9-10 months from now. Yep.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you again all thank you for braving the traffic. Bless you. Thank you for braving traffic and spending your valuable time with us. Appreciate it.